To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you. Your support truly makes this show possible. We couldn't do any of this without you. If you value our work and you want to help keep the project going, become a patron. We rely on listeners like you to sustain the show, and you can join at patreon.com/deathpanelpod and get access to the weekly bonus episodes and our full back catalog with hundreds of hours of bonus content. And to help us out some more, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, hold reading or discussion groups, share the show with someone who needs to hear it, and of course, you can also follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today my guest is Dr. Jonathan Howard. Jonathan is a neurologist and psychiatrist who has worked in New York City hospitals throughout COVID, as well as a longtime advocate for vaccination. He is also the author of the books Cognitive Errors and Diagnostic Mistakes, as well as We Want Them Infected, which is about the failed quest for COVID herd immunity and how that galvanized the recent embrace of the anti-vaccine movement. He also has a new book coming out called Everyone Else is Lying to You. And for years, he has been a thorn in the side of the two figures that we're going to be discussing today, Doctors Marty Makary and Jay Bhattacharya, through the articles that he's written for Science-Based Medicine. Jonathan, welcome to the Death Panel. It's so great to have you back on the show.
Hey, it's wonderful to be here. I wish it was happier times.
Likewise. And now you and I have known each other for quite a long time. You were even on the show to talk about the anti-vaccine movement way back pre-COVID in 2019. And not even back then did I think we would ever be struggling alongside each other against this crew of crank doctors for this many years. But here we are. And when we were catching up recently, we discussed that it would be useful for folks to get a refresher on two figures who are central to the Make America Healthy Again crew, but who have been getting far less attention and deserve just as much scrutiny and critical skepticism as RFK Jr. So today, we're talking about these two key figures who have both been appointed for important positions within the administrative state by the second Trump administration. Today is going to be a refresher on Dr. Marty Makary, who is Trump's nominee for FDA commissioner, and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who has been nominated for NIH director. If those names sound familiar, and they likely will to longtime Death Panel listeners, it's because these two guys have played key roles in shaping the narrative of the COVID pandemic, encouraging denialism and the abandonment of vulnerable folks, the working class, and children, undermining public health, and helping to mainstream the idea that any measures taken towards protecting people from a deadly virus are somehow an authoritarian overreach. Now, at first glance, however, Makary and Bhattacharya might not seem as extreme as a figure like RFK Jr., but that's exactly the problem that we're going to try and address in our conversation today. I think part of the reason that they often come off like more acceptable nominees is they're hiding behind the veneer of respectability and their expertise. They're both doctors, they have academic credentials and affiliations with major universities. But as you've been documenting their advocacy and work for years, you've shown time and time again that their influence is anything but reasonable. So I just want to start us there today with why these nominations should be just as alarming as some of the more obviously fringe appointments that we've seen, and why their brand of less obviously foul rhetoric is actually kind of more dangerous in some ways because it comes wrapped in institutional legitimacy.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a lot of important points there, that these guys can talk calmly, they can talk in scientific jargon, and they can come across as very reasonable. And they come from top institutions like Stanford and Johns Hopkins. And they are not as obviously unhinged as RFK Jr., but that makes them in some ways much scarier. But when you actually examine their COVID record, I think they got as many things wrong as he did, although they are deep in the process of rewriting the history of the pandemic. How they talk about COVID in 2025 is very different than how they talked about it in 2020.
Absolutely. Now, for folks who don't know anything about their backgrounds, maybe let's start with Bhattacharya, who's at Stanford. Do you mind talking a little bit about who Jay is, what his realm of expertise is, and what you would sum up as his sort of main hobby horses that he likes to focus on?
Yeah, so he got a medical degree, but never did a residency and never treated any patients on his own. And he became a health economist at Stanford. He is not someone who I had heard of before the pandemic. He wildly underestimated COVID. In March 2020, he wrote an article titled, "Is the Coronavirus as Deadly as They Say?" And at that time, he speculated that COVID had, quote, a 0.01% mortality rate, which is 1/10 of the flu mortality rate. And he speculated that a 20 to 40,000 epidemic is what the United States would see. He felt that herd immunity was at hand. In July 2020, he declared that Sweden and New York had reached herd immunity. And then he became most famous for his co-authorship of the Great Barrington Declaration, which I know your readers are very familiar with. And to hear Dr. Bhattacharya talk about the Great Barrington Declaration in 2025, he will say things like, "It was just about protecting the vulnerable and keeping poor children in school and helping the working class." In reality, if you actually read the Great Barrington Declaration, it claimed that the mass infection of unvaccinated youth would lead to herd immunity in 3 to 6 months. And I use the word youth there very loosely because Dr. Bhattacharya claimed that COVID was, quote, much milder for people under 70, believe it or not. And it was written in conjunction with Jeffrey Tucker, who I imagine your listeners are also familiar with, but a libertarian who is a overt and proud child labor advocate. So in 2020, Dr. Bhattacharya was all about herd immunity via natural immunity, although he won't mention those words at all now. And in order to make his case, he spread a lot of wild misinformation and fake statistics. For example, in November 2020, after COVID killed about 130 children or so, and the flu had killed 9, he said the flu killed more children. So it's not even questions of opinion at this point. It's really he just repeatedly got basic facts wrong all the time.
Now, Makary, on the other hand, he's at Johns Hopkins. Let's talk through Makary's background.
Yeah, so he's a pancreatic surgeon, and he was someone who I was aware of before the pandemic. He was the originator of this zombie myth that medical error is the third leading cause of death, which, if you just stop and think about it, doesn't make sense because it would imply that over half of patients who die in a hospital do so due to medical error. And it's just one of those numbers that on the surface of it doesn't make any sense. And you know who wrote a great rebuttal to that before the pandemic was Dr. Vinay Prasad.
Ironically.
Ironically. And I think Dr. Marty Makary was actually pretty reasonable at the first year or so of the pandemic. However, in December 2020, and it's hard to remember exactly what was happening at this time, the years kind of blend together. This was right when vaccines were coming out, but also right before the worst wave or the worst month of the pandemic, which was January 2021. Dr. Makary got it in his head that we only needed to vaccinate about 20% of people to reach herd immunity. Then, in February 2021, he wrote his most infamous article, "We'll have herd immunity by April." And he continued on that theme throughout the spring of 2021, writing articles called "Herd Immunity is Near Despite Fauci's Denial," and "It's Time to Stop Living in Fear," and "Don't Buy the Fear Mongering. The COVID-19 threat is waning." Those are all from spring 2021. And then he went on to announce that he had been right. In May 2021, he said, "We are basically in herd immunity now, and most of the country is at herd immunity." He claimed that one COVID infection led to decades, if not lifelong immunity, even though, of course, the virus had been out for about a year at that point. When the Delta variant arrived, he said, "For most people right now, Delta is downgraded to a mild seasonal virus that causes mild common cold-like symptoms." When the Omicron variant came out, he called it Omacold and nature's vaccine, even though the Omicron variant killed and hospitalized more children than any variant before. So this was his sort of pattern, was to get things wrong. And rather than to admit error, was to just keep doubling down over and over again, while simultaneously, and Dr. Bhattacharya did this too, calling on everyone else to admit error, to say, you guys got it wrong, you fess up, you admit your sins. And both of these doctors fluffed our RFK Jr. Well before he was on Trump's radar, which is a very terrifying thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting that Makary's claims about medical error became like a huge sort of pop sci media phenomenon. This happened around 2016, 2017, where this paper came out, where they made this kind of like extrapolated claim about medical error being like this huge, third leading cause of death. And this was picked up by like so many media outlets, right? It was reported on, taken as fact, and a lot of work has gone into debunking it, but the kind of media relationships that he established through the promotion of that paper helped to create this real momentum behind the myth, such that you hear it casually repeated as if it is common sense and common knowledge all the time. And I think that it's really important to sort of think about, how their claims have had this whole sort of life within the media ecosystem as well, where we're thinking about really, this is not just like two bad guys, but two guys who have used, hubris and their positions within well-respected institutions, within institutions that kind of command respect in the media, to perpetuate claims that, are not only not true, but also towards a kind of goal that encourages the abandonment and undermining of really kind of doing anything to mitigate all sorts of different health crises, whether it's Bhattacharya's work on the affordability of health insurance or COVID, or Makary talking about medical error, or, minimizing the impact of the COVID virus right before the worst period of death in the United States. This all has material consequences. It's not just that they're like cranks who say things that are wrong. They say things and people respect what they have to say. They're associated with these institutions. And this is really a kind of broad, like, ideological project that's important to understand in that context, not just in the kind of like, these are cranks, they're bad, what they said is wrong, right? Like, these guys are going to have a material impact in these positions if they're confirmed. And when you lay them up against RFK Jr., like a melted Kennedy, like, they seem a lot more reasonable. They offer respectability to Kennedy's agenda, and they have for a long time, but they also run the risk of kind of like slipping by under the radar because they really don't come off as weird in the same way. I mean, they come off like respectable experts, really. And that's part of the problem.
Absolutely. If Jay Bhattacharya was here right now, he would object to your characterization of the Great Barrington Declaration. He would say, we didn't call for doing nothing. It was not a let it rip strategy. We called for protecting the vulnerable. And if I was someone who was in a coma and woke up today and heard Dr. Bhattacharya speak, I would probably find that very convincing. Yeah, why not just protect the vulnerable? But when you actually read his plan to protect the vulnerable, if you actually go to the Great Barrington Declaration and read their frequently asked questions section, it wasn't a plan. It was just this list of demands. So their question, how do we protect older people living at home? Their answer was 4 sentences long. So it wasn't a plan. If a medical student handed in a plan to treat the patient that was 4 sentences long, I would probably fail them, for example. But that's what they did. But they speak very confidently. And again, they just make things up, such as the flu is more dangerous for children than COVID. So once you get it into your head that these guys are just going to make things up and you can't trust anything they say, that exposes them, I think, as the people who they truly are, which are political operatives masquerading as doctors.
Yeah, and I think that what's important to sort of think about too is that this is all towards a broader agenda. And one of the things that both Makary and Bhattacharya have spent years talking about, almost more so than the things they've advocated for or claimed, has been more about attacks on science and censorship, which I think is particularly important for us to talk about in the context of the early actions of the Trump administration. We've seen a historic and quite unusual censorship of the morbidity and mortality weekly reports shut down. These have been continuously publishing since the 1950s, and they were paused immediately upon Trump taking office. We saw National Science Foundation funding paused. We saw NIH and CDC communications paused. We've seen the use of executive orders to kind of use this like cloak and dagger strategy of rooting out DEI, wokeness, and, transgenderism and Green New Deal framings in order to essentially kind of shut down the funding architecture that keeps a lot of like scientific and medical research up and running. And for years and years, both Makary and Bhattacharya have really spent so much time insisting that they're being censored for telling the truth about COVID. And that one of the reasons why they've been talked about positively is as figures who would come into these positions at NIH and FDA who would stand against censorship, quote unquote. But I think that what's important to think about is really what they mean when they say that they would stand against censorship. This kind of claim of victimhood has also really worked to their advantage, saying, we have these huge platforms, but we're being censored for telling the truth about COVID at the same time where their work is like being widely disseminated and promoted. And what they really mean often by censorship is that someone like you or I had the gall to like question the motives behind their speech, right? Now, there's like a real difference between the kind of censorship that they're talking about and the censorship that's actually already occurred in the context of science communication and medical research by the Trump administration. So let's talk a little bit about Makary and Bhattacharya's censorship narrative and how this kind of fits into, why they're particularly important nominees to resist and hopefully not see confirmed.
Well, they're going to be confirmed. If RFK is going to make it through, they're going to make it through. There's no question about it. I mean, I just have to be sort of brutally honest about this. For them not to be confirmed, some Republican senators would have to do the right thing. Have you seen any evidence that that's going to be the case?
No.
Of course not. So they're going to be confirmed. And they, as you said, were absolutely not censored and silenced. They became celebrities, which is how they got noticed to run the FDA and the NIH. Any doctor who was truly silenced, we didn't hear about them because they were silenced. We don't know their names. So Dr. Bhattacharya developed a very bad case of main character syndrome, where he centered himself during the pandemic, and he centered his social media content. That by far and away was the most important thing to him. And I didn't really follow the details of it. My understanding is that perhaps the Biden administration asked Twitter, back when it was Twitter, to deprioritize misinformation tweets, and some of his tweets were deprioritized by the Twitter algorithm. Dr. Bhattacharya took that case all the way to the Supreme Court, where he lost. And again, my understanding as to why he lost is because he didn't prove that he had standing, meaning he couldn't prove that he had been harmed in any way. So that's why he lost that case. But just type Dr. J. Bhattacharya's name into YouTube along with censorship or free speech, and you will see that he gave speeches titled, "The End of Free Speech is the End of Science." And let me just read a quote from a press release put out by Ron DeSantis. Again, this guy got famous. He met with President Trump. He advised Ron DeSantis. He gave thousands of interviews while I was treating patients in the hospital. And here's what he had to say after YouTube removed one video So this is just one YouTube video. He said, for science to work, you have to have an open exchange of ideas. If you're going to make an argument that something is misinformation, you should provide an actual argument. You can't just take it down and say, oh, it's misinformation without actually giving a reason. Let's hear the argument. Let's see the evidence that YouTube used to decide it was misinformation. Let's have a debate. Science works best when we have an open debate. So have you heard Dr. Bhattacharya say anything about the mass censorship that's going on now?
No, of course not.
Of course not. And even
because
though he says
it's his kind of censorship.
Exactly right.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.